Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Creamsicle Chronicle podcast. My name is JT Olson, potentially flying solo, maybe having a co-host, not totally sure. Garrett messaged me, said, "Hey, can we record earlier tonight? I've been up since 3 a.m." I said, "Sure, no problem, just let me get the kids to bed." 2 hours after that, the kids are finally in bed and it's our normal recording time, so I reach out to him. "Hey, we're ready to go." No response, probably asleep. So we're hoping Garrett wakes up. We know he's out there. He should be returning to the pod soon. We are getting up to speed to be a full go, beginning our draft prep. And that's going to start tonight, talking about the NFL Combine. This is a process that is very important. And, it's not so much, someone ran, 4.340, like, congratulations, Marcus Golden. That was way faster than I expected you to run, but that's not really what I care about. The combine, for Tampa Bay Buccaneer purposes, comes down to three things: interviews and medicals. Those two, you got to interview well, you got to be a good locker room fit, and you got to be healthy. Those are non-negotiables. And the third thing is you got to hit thresholds. We know Jason Light has specific types he wants to draft. If you're a corner, you better be above 6 feet tall. Sorry, Jahdae Barron. I love you. I wish you'd be a Buccaneer, but I don't see that happening. He just doesn't hit the Buccaneers' threshold. Malachi Starks, you're a really good safety. You didn't hit the athletic testing threshold, so it's not going to happen. Did not hit that 9.0 in terms of relative athletic score. If you are not paying attention to these RAS scores, then you are out of the loop. Because Jason Light has not used his first pick on a player below a 9 RAS since Jameis Winston. Since that, every year, the player he drafts are in the 90th percentile of athlete relative to their position. Even going back to Vernon Hargraves, O.J. Howard, Vita Vea, Devin White, Tristan Wirfs, Logan Hall. Every player since Jameis Winston, the first pick they use, it is going to be in a guy who has a 9 or higher RAS score. So already some players are weeding themselves out on who will be the Bucs' first-round pick. And we're still collecting data. There's still going to be some pro days. Some players didn't test. Will Johnson, the cornerback from Michigan, didn't test. I don't think Nick Scorton, the edge rusher from Texas A&M, tested. And those are guys who I think the Bucs would be realistically in on. But they got to hit those metrics. They got to hit those thresholds. And at this point in time, we don't know if they would. Nick Scorton doesn't look like an outstanding athlete on tape. Will Johnson does, but we'll see on his pro day. Or his private workout, since he's not going to work at his pro day. Maybe not a great sign. So we got to see some players who the Bucs will probably be in on. We got to see Shamar Stewart, another edge rusher out of Texas A&M. Dude is a freak athlete. A perfect score with the RAS. He is one of one athletically. The problem with him, he's only had 1.5 sacks each of the last 3 years. Grand total of 4.5 sacks in his entire college career. For a guy who's that athletic, that's incredibly low levels of production. And that could be a little bit of a red flag. That is Trayvon Walker kind of stuff. Great athlete, good football player, could be a great football player, but isn't yet. There's some risk reward there, but he has all the things the Bucs are looking for, so he's probably, if nothing else, in play. Jalen Walker, linebacker / edge rusher out of Georgia. He's a weird one because as a linebacker, he's very raw. He cannot cover. He is a freak athlete. He can attack forward, kind of like Devin White, except Devin White was never an edge rusher. He was a guy who could blitz as a middle linebacker because he was so athletic. Where Jalen Walker is a legitimate edge rusher. He has the speed, he has the power, he has some rush moves to work with, although he is still a work in progress. The problem with him as an edge rusher, he is teeny tiny compared to other edge rushers. He is like 5th percentile, bottom 10th percentile in most meaningful metrics in terms of size. Is that a deal breaker? Absolutely not. Because dude is a freak athlete. He can get after the quarterback. But size limitations might be a problem at the NFL level. And he's not going to be going up against Vanderbilt or Kentucky in the NFL. He's got to do it against real players. Penei Sewell, Lane Johnson. I mean, if you are small going against guys like that, you're going to get swallowed up. So, again, he's a risk and reward player. What's up, Stefan Pryor? Thank you for tuning in. All upgrades, yes, absolutely. These are first-round targets. These are players who will make the defense better. Are they perfect players? Not at all. But they are useful players. Maybe a third down specialist. Maybe he's linebacker for the first 2 downs, and then he's rushing the passer on third down. Very much in play. He's someone who I think the Bucs will be looking at. Another one who's been a very popular name, Jihad Campbell, linebacker from Alabama. Tested very well. He is the heir apparent to Levante David if the Bucs were to draft him. He is fluid. He is physical. Bigger body, 6'2", 240, 245. That was his listed weight at Alabama last year. Weighed in a little later at the combine. Got to get those 40 times up. But where he really shines is in coverage. He is an excellent coverage linebacker, which is really what the Bucs need. They need someone in the middle of the defense, in the middle of that zone, who can take plays away, cover the tight end, make sure there isn't a giant gaping hole for Kirk Cousins to gash this defense. And he'd be really good at that. That's where he thrives. He is someone, by all accounts, is super high character, very hard worker. He is a name I think the Bucs are going to consider in a big way. Is he a pass rusher? Not really. He can blitz, but that was never his role in college. He came into Alabama as an edge player, but he's been a full-time middle linebacker, and that's what he'll be in the NFL. Yes, we need better coverage, and this is where a guy like Jihad Campbell would come into play. Great in coverage. Another guy I mentioned earlier, Will Johnson, cornerback out of Michigan. He'd be another great coverage player. And his stock is slipping a little bit in this pre-draft process. He had a rough final year of college. He got hurt, wasn't as good as his previous year. He hasn't really been able to do a lot of the athletic testing. Some people have questioned how fast he is, but this guy is a ball hawk. He is great in zone, great in man, interception machine, pick sixes. He was the best coverage player on that Michigan championship defense. And I think he did that as a true sophomore. So he's young, big body, 6'1", 6'2", 200 pounds. He would be a huge upgrade to someone like Jamel Dean. And I think if he slides, the Bucs should be in play there. I don't think he'll slide that far, but we'll see. Crazier things have happened. This is a good cornerback draft. It's a lot of names people are going to look at. Jahdae Barron, Travis Hunter, Benjamin Morrison, Savon Ravel. There's a lot of cornerbacks people are looking at. I think Will Johnson's probably the only one the Bucs would consider in the first. Just because Benjamin Morrison, he's a really good coverage player, pretty soft as a tackler, but he's got a nagging hip injury, so we don't really know what his health is right now. Same with Savon Ravel. Good athlete. I don't know that he's a great athlete, but he missed most of last year with an injury. So these are two guys, they can't do athletic testing. Their stock is probably lower than it could be. And I just don't think the Bucs are going to look that way in the first round. Second round, absolutely. I would take either of those guys in the second round. I'd prefer Ravel because I don't love Morrison's tackling. He's not physical, but he's really good in coverage. But I just think Ravel fits this defense better. Big body, long arms, zone coverage. He is really the prototype for what the Bucs are looking for in their defense right now. And then, what do you think about Ezeraku? Getting a lot of first-round buzz. Haven't watched him yet myself. Shane, thanks for tuning in. He's another one. If you measure him as a defensive end, he came in with a RAS score in the mid-sevens, which does not meet Buccaneers thresholds. Got to be 9 or higher with the RAS score. However, if you measure him as a linebacker, because that's what he is. He's a linebacker. He's an edge rusher. He's not really truly a throwback defensive end. As a linebacker, he tested in the mid-9, so he would definitely qualify as someone the Bucs would be looking at. Is he an elite athlete? I don't know. I think he's a good athlete. He's got great bend around the edge. But what he is an absolute technician. He has the deepest arsenal of pass rush moves in this draft. And he has elite bend. When you look at the agility drills, his scores are very, very comparable to Khalil Mack. And I'm not saying he's going to be Khalil Mack, because Mack was also a freak athlete. But in terms of agility, in terms of bend around the edge, the two are very, very similar. In terms of skill and how they use their hands, there's probably not a better player in this draft than Ezeraku. Comes off as super high character. He is someone who's always working. He was someone who shined at the Senior Bowl, which is that's another place the Bucs really look for in terms of talent. Put a lot of stock into Senior Bowl players. Really, he checks all the boxes. Super productive in the ACC, 16 and a half sacks. He had 80 tackles, so he's not just a pass rusher. He is someone, he will play the run. He will move in space. He is really a perfect fit for what the Bucs want. And he should be available at pick 19. So is he the freak athlete that a Shamar Stewart is? That a Jalen Walker is? No, he isn't. Athletically, he doesn't compare to those two. But he's a good enough athlete. He's great in terms of agility and bend, and he's the most polished pass rusher in the draft. And I think it'll translate. He can do outside. He can do inside. He's got counters on counters. I think he's a perfect fit. Ideally, the Bucs could trade back a little bit and get him. But he's someone, his stock is on the rise. So I don't know if that'll be possible. They might just stick at 19 and get their guy, and I'd have no problem with it. Christopher Cole, thanks for tuning in, man. We appreciate you. Good to see you again. So those are a couple of the big names who I think the Bucs are going to be looking at. There might be a couple of defensive tackles they look at, a guy like Walter Nolan, a guy like Darius Alexander, both guys who can rush the passer. Not an edge rusher, which is really the direction I think they should go, but a pass rusher. Bump Logan Hall to the bench, get an upgrade. You got Cansey, you got V, and you got a guy like Darius Williams. That's a nasty defensive line who can get after the quarterback. I will take that. That's not my preferred route, but if that's the direction they go, I won't be mad at it because you still get the pass rusher you're looking for, just not on the edge. So the Bucs are going to have a lot of options. I think where they're picking is kind of a sweet spot. And even if they go secondary in the first round, say they draft Will Johnson, this is a deep group of edge rushers. You can get a guy in the second round who could also be very productive. A guy like Princely Umanlalian, and I know I butchered that last name, but he's an edge rusher from Ole Miss. Very flexible, very bendy around the edge. He physically is like the prototype of what an edge rusher is supposed to look like. He's not polished with his pass rush moves. He's kind of a work in progress. Really, probably more of an athlete than a football player. But again, a great athlete who could be a great football player. So he could be in play if they go pass rush in the second round. Another guy who I really like is Josiah Stewart from Michigan. He is a little undersized, kind of Shaq Barrett-esque. He's like 6'1", 245, 250. He is feisty against the run. Just because he's small does not mean he's nothing as a run defender. But he is speed, he is bend, he is pass rush. So I think the Bucs are set up really well in this particular draft to get an impact pass rusher in the first or second round. Personally, I would rather them go first round. Jason Light has not invested enough into the edge rusher position. And people give him a hard time saying he's no good at drafting edge rushers. I don't think that's true. I just think he hasn't invested adequate resources into edge rusher. I mean, yeah, he got a first-round pick, the last pick in the first round, into Joe Tryon-Shoyinka. But even then, we knew that player was high risk, high reward. Someone who was very raw, a great athlete, but not a great football player. Remember, that was coming off the COVID year where he sat out a lot of that season, if not all of it. So we knew that was going to be a boomer bust kind of pick, and he busted. You know, that's an uppercut swing. You swing for the fences with the back end of the first round. It didn't work out. That's kind of how that game works. Other than that, you got Yaya Diaby in the third. That was a really great pick. He's an impact player. Maybe not a true number one pass rusher, which is fine. He's a third-round pick. But he is part of your rotation. He is a starting edge for you, and a quality one at that. So I think that's a win. Chris Braswell, it's a little too early to say. I still feel good about that pick. I was really high on him as a second-round pick coming out, and I knew right away he'd be a slow burn. Power players don't translate to the NFL extremely quickly. It takes them a little bit longer. So we'll see what kind of progress he makes in year two. Anthony Nelson was a fourth-round pick. He's been a vital rotation part of this defense. I'll call that a win. Jose Ramirez is on the roster as a sixth-round pick, and really for a sixth-round pick, what more can you ask for? I mean, again, not premium resources there. And then you go back to the days of Noah Spence, and that was another kind of boomer bust pick. Really great talent, but off the field problems. So I think Jason Light has done fine drafting edges when he's invested in them. And the ones that haven't worked out, you knew were a little bit boom or bust. And they just happened to bust. There's some of that in this year's draft with a guy like Shamar Stewart, who I think is better than his stats indicate, but he's still going to be a little bit boom or bust. Jalen Walker, looks like a really high ceiling potential, but he's like a 6'1" edge rusher, 235 pounds. He's really built like a linebacker. There's some boom or bust potential there. Really, the only ones who aren't boom or bust are a guy like Ezaraku, who I really like. Mike Green, I think, is going to be a very solid player at worst. I think he's a very high floor player with a high ceiling. And I think if his character stuff checks out, he'll be very much in play for the Bucs. And again, this is a guy, Mike Green, he put up 28 reps on the bench press. Strong. Stronger than his little frame indicates. So I think he's someone, as long as the character checks out, he'll be in play for the Bucs at 19. That's a big if, because those of you who don't know, he does have sexual assault allegations that have followed him from Virginia for a couple of years ago. We don't know what that looks like. In the camera, he says all the right things. He's trying to be accountable. He's trying to answer all his questions. But we really don't know who Mike is behind closed doors. Mike Green, he could be Justin Tucker. He could be Deshaun Watson. We really have no idea. That's something that Jason Light needs to weed out. And that is something that's a high priority for him. We know how much he values high character players. So if there is any question on who Mike Green is as a person, moving forward, the Bucs will be out on him. But if they've interviewed him and he's answered all their questions and they feel comfortable with him as a man, then he could very much be the pick at 19. And I think he's going to be a really good player somewhere. I think Green and Ezaraku are probably the leaders in the clubhouse on who could be Bucs. And again, huge caveat with Green. But if it checks out, I think it comes down to those two. With Shamar Stewart and Walker, those being alternative plans because they are more high risk. This is a team, they don't want to swing and miss. They are in a contending window right now. They need a contributor right now. And maybe that'll be a guy like Walker, or maybe that'll be a guy like Shamar Stewart. But you know what you're getting with a guy like Mike Green. You know what you're getting with a guy like Donovan Ezeraku. So I think they'll probably lean in that direction. So that's where we're at. Athletically, those are the guys who really check the boxes. I wish Jahdae Barron did. I wish he was taller than what he is, because the Bucs always target tall corners. And Jahdae Barron is just 5'10", 5'11". But he is a really, really good football player who would fit really perfectly in this defense. He's a guy who I don't think the Bucs are in on, but I would love to see in Tampa Bay. And that's one of those ones where I don't care. I rip everything up, throw out the thresholds. You pick him because he's a really good football player. I don't think Jason Light will do that because he hasn't in a decade. But I would love to see Jahdae Barron in Tampa Bay. Other than that, there's some guards who I like. Tyler Booker tested really poorly. He will not be a selection in the first round. Maybe not even the second round. But Donovan Jackson, left guard from Ohio State, if he's on the board in the second round, I think he should very much be in play. I would even think twice about him in the first round because he's that good. But offensive line is really not the priority in this draft. It is pass rusher. It is a linebacker who can cover. Maybe a corner. Maybe a safety. Nick Kamawarie, big safety out of South Carolina. Freak athlete. He could be in play. I don't know that he will be because I don't necessarily think he's the Bucs type. The Bucs did not interview him at the Combine, but he checks a lot of the boxes on what they look for. Maybe a guy like Xavier Watts in the second round, ball hawk safety from Notre Dame. He's had 13 interceptions the last 2 seasons. I think he had 7 this year and 6 last year. And that Notre Dame defense is really good. They were one of the playoff teams. They made a little noise in the playoffs. And the defense is a big reason why. I think they're in the championship game, actually. I'm pretty sure Notre Dame went to the championship game. They were the team that got bludgeoned by Ohio State. But they were there because of that defense. And Xavier Watts is a player I really like. Super physical against the run. Maybe not the best athlete, but his instincts are fantastic. Former wide receiver. He can just diagnose everything that's in front of him. That's a guy who I think will be in play for the Bucs in the second round. But first round, I really think it's going to be pass rusher. I really think it's going to be linebacker, possibly in Jaheed Campbell. I think that's a clear-cut direction on where they're going. I don't think they'll go wide receiver, even though they interviewed some of the top names in this draft. They interviewed Matthew Golden, who ran a 4.3 40. He catches everything. I think he'd be a really good player on this team. I just don't see that being the direction they go. Tyler Warren, tight end out of Penn State. Some people compare him to a guy like Rob Gronkowski. I think he'd be a really good player for the Bucs. I think he's going to be a really good player in the NFL. I just don't think that's the direction the Bucs would go. Even though they interviewed both of those guys, even though both of those guys check a lot of the boxes, I think there's going to be a defensive-focused draft. And we all know why. All Todd Bowles talked about, all Jason Light talked about was 2 things. Getting pressure with 4 and getting ball hawks. I mean, I don't care how much you like Tyler Warren. He's not rushing the passer. Matthew Golden is not going to be dropping into coverage for you. So even though they interviewed those guys, even though they check the boxes, even though I think they're both really good players, I don't think they're in play for the Bucs. It'll be pass rusher or possibly linebacker or if the right corner falls. But it all comes back to Jason Light in the trenches. Mike Green, Donovan Ezeraku, Shamir Stewart, Jalen Walker, and then Jaheed Campbell. I think those are your 5. You highlight those names, you see who's available, and you make the best pick at the time. Right now, my money's on Ezeraku. I think he's the best fit. His character is the cleanest. He is the most polished. I think he's the guy right now. Biggest impact on the defense's coaching staff changes. Yeah, there are going to be there's some shuffling around. Caldwell, they got back from Jacksonville. He was their defensive coordinator. He's going to be working with the inside linebackers. Larry Foote bumping out, working with the outside linebackers. That could make a big difference for a guy like Chris Braswell. I think it'll help. I mean, Caldwell was the linebackers coach when the Bucs won the Super Bowl. He's the one who maximized Devin White. So if you get a guy like Jalen Walker, you trust a guy like Caldwell to develop him, to work with him, to mold him. I feel good about that. That makes it more of a good fit. So, yeah, I do think the coaching changes are going to pay dividends. I do think they are impactful. And I do think they could shape what direction the Bucs go in the draft. But more than anything, free agency. That will shape what the Bucs are going to do next. They're going to fill out the roster. They're going to address some needs. And there's a couple of names who I really like for the Bucs. They have a little money to play with. They could do some restructuring. Guys like Tristan Wirfs, Antoine Winfield, Baker Mayfield. They could shuffle some money around and create more cap space. And there are 4 big-ish names who I want the Bucs to be looking at. And if they can get 2 or 3 of them, I'll walk away from free agency very happy. One of those names has to be a linebacker. And news of the day, Levante David is coming back. 1 more year. Season 14. Love it. $10 million, $9 million guaranteed. He will be your attacking linebacker. He's the one who's going to be on blitzes. He is going to be moving forward. If he's dropping back into coverage, that's not ideal because we saw him take a step backwards in that last year. But he is still an elite linebacker in terms of instincts, in terms of processing what's in front of him. He can shoot gaps. He can find space. He can pressure the quarterback. The Bucs are going to utilize him like that. But that still leaves a big need for coverage linebackers. Maybe that's Servassier Dennis. I'm very high on Servassier Dennis. But we've only seen him play like 4 or 5 games. And he's looked good in those 4 or 5 games. But I think getting a proven veteran will only help, especially at linebacker. The linebacker market is robust this year. There are a lot of linebackers. There's a decent amount already been spent on linebackers. But compared to other positions, linebackers are relatively cheap. It's kind of like how the Eagles spent $20 million on Saquon Barkley last year. They got an MVP candidate for like half the cost of a starting quarterback. Linebackers kind of the same way. I mean, you can get them for half the price of an edge rusher. Of an upper tier edge rusher, you can get an elite linebacker for half the price. So whether it is a Dre Greenlaw or whoever, I would still like to see the Bucs invest in linebacker and sign a proven guy who can cover. There are a couple on the market. Dre Greenlaw is probably the biggest name out there, and I think it'd be a great fit, assuming he's healthy. But there are other guys. I'm open, I'm flexible, as long as they can cover. So that's 1. Got to get a linebacker. Right now, my preference is Greenlaw. 2, I would like to see an upgrade at starting corner. And a guy I really like is Paulson Adebo. He was the cornerback in New Orleans. He is a big body. He is a ball hawk. He's got a history of making turnovers. He would do really well in the Bucs defense. He's a really good athlete. Only 25-year-old. I don't think he's going to command a ton of money. He'll get a healthy salary. But I think he would be a great addition for this defense. Paulson Adebo, Zion McCollum, that's a really nice duo. If they can get him, I'll be very comfortable with where the secondary is. Adebo, McCollum, Winfield, Tyke Smith. You add a safety in the draft, you round it out. That is a good secondary. I'd be very happy with that. Number 3, I want to bring in a pass rusher. And it doesn't have to be someone who's going to revolutionize the position. This does not have to be Myles Garrett. Would I like it to be? Sure, I would. Myles Garrett's the best defensive player in football. Maybe the best player in football. Trey Hendrickson. He's really good. And I would be very happy to have him on this team. But even if the Bucs go after a second-tier guy as part of the rotation and they invest in edge rusher in the first round, I think that's still a winning formula. Whether that's a guy like Harold Landry, who was just cut today, or Azeez Ojulari, or Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack. You figure out which one of these guys is the best fit for you, and you get him. And he is a part of the solution. If Joey Bosa is coming off your bench, reduces the risk of him being injured, he can get you 5-6 sacks a year. Yaya gets you 5 sacks a year. Insert first-round edge rusher can get you 4 to 6 sacks this year. All of a sudden, your outside pass rush is a lot stronger. So pick a guy. There's a lot of options. I just don't want to overpay for a guy like Josh Sweat, who just won a Super Bowl with the Eagles. He had a really great Super Bowl performance. His price tag is going to be sky high. But any of those other guys, I'd feel really comfortable with as part of the solution. No one guy is going to be the answer unless it's a guy like Myles Garrett, unless it's a guy like Hendrickson. But you add a couple of pieces, and each guy helps. You piece it together and make the solution that way. Also very effective. Especially for Todd Bowles, who likes to run kind of hockey shifts. You get 4 guys in, they run a series, you sub them out, a new 4 comes in. And that can be frustrating at times. But if you get, your A team is V, Cansey, Yaya, and say Joey Bosa, pick a name, whatever. And then you bring in Logan Hall, and you bring in, another depth defensive tackle. You got Donovan Ezeraku or Shamir Stewart on the outside, and you got Anthony Nelson or Chris Braswell. That becomes a good second line. You feel comfortable there. You can mix and match these guys. So you find whatever edge rusher, who you think is going to fit the room, who you think best fits the defense. I like Harold Landry. I think he'd be a great mentor for these young edge rushers, a guy who has always been praised for his hard work. He is a feisty run defender. He can really teach some of these younger guys like Yaya, like Braswell, like whoever they draft in the first round. That is a great veteran to have. Khalil Mack is a future Hall of Famer. And I don't know how much he has left in the tank, but just imagine how much he could teach a young player. Even Joey Bosa. He is a multiple-time Pro Bowler. His technique, his hand usage has always been fantastic. And his body hasn't held up the test of time. But in terms of the refinement of the game, the skill of the game, the technique of the game, he is excellent. So you get that veteran, you bring him in as part of the answer. That's number 3. And number 4, I would really like to upgrade at left guard. Ben Bredesen, he was a nice surprise last year. He was solid, but he was the weak point in the line. His anchor was not strong enough. So I'd like to get a more powerful guard like Tevin Jenkins. He was a left guard for the Bears, and he's a guy, he started his career as a right tackle. They moved him inside, and he just hasn't been able to stay healthy. But when he's been on the field, he has turned into a very nice guard. He's always been very physical. He's always had that nasty, mean streak to him. He's a guy who wants to put defensive linemen in the dirt. And I like that attitude. And if you put him next to Tristan Wirfs, you are going to maximize Tristan Wirfs. Because Tristan, he hides holes. Bredesen looked better because he played next to Tristan Wirfs. There's no doubt about that. But if you upgrade that, if you bring in a Jenkins and replace Bredesen, well, then you are not only making your left guard spot better, but you're also making Tristan Wirfs better, which might not even be possible because he is that good. But you really want to put him in the best position possible to succeed. And that's improving what's next to him. So I'm all for buying a little bit low on a guy who's been injury prone. I'm for taking flyers on some of these positions, like a Joey Bosa, like a Tevin Jenkins, guys who have been hurt. We saw the Philadelphia Eagles buy low on a bunch of players, and some of them washed out. They didn't work. Devin White was not good for them, and he was cut. But we saw some of them work really well. You bought low on a guy like Zach Bond, and he turned into an all-pro. You bought low on a guy like Mekhi Becton. They turned him into a quality guard after he flopped at tackle. I mean, that was a guy who was picked above Tristan Wirfs, and he washed out of New York. And he wound up as a guard in Philadelphia, and he helped him win the Super Bowl. So I'm in favor of taking flyers on free agents. And if they don't work, that's fine. You replace them next year. But if Tevin Jenkins comes here on a lower end contract and he turns into a Pro Bowl caliber guard, that really puts you in a good position this year, in a year that you are chasing a Super Bowl. Because Levante David, Mike Evans, these guys aren't going to be around forever. They only have 1 or 2 years left, really playing at high level. So you really have to go for it now. Take a flyer, bring in a flawed but talented player, and you try and get the most out of him. And if it doesn't work, if he gets hurt, that's fine. You have depth. You bring in Eli Klein, who they drafted last year at guard. You bring in a Chris Braswell to start on the edge, or your first-round pick to start on the edge. You build a full roster, so if you do lose a guy and it doesn't work out, you still have someone behind him who could be an impact player. But if there is talent to be had and you can take a chance on it, I think the Bucs are absolutely in a position to take a chance on these guys. So those are my 4 high priorities. Coverage linebacker, rotational pass rusher who is high end, Paulson Adebo, Tevin Jenkins. I'd really like to see Adebo. I think he is the most sure thing in that group. I think he is going to be a plus starter for whoever signs him, and I want that team to be the Bucs. Because at 25, I think his best days are still ahead of him, and Jamel Dean continues to get hurt. He can't force turnovers. I think his best days are probably behind him. So I would like to see Adebo as the number 1 target, along with a linebacker. And if you can get one of these edge players, or if you can get Tevin Jenkins, even better. But I really think the Bucs need to get 2 of those key highlighted guys. And then you fill in the rest. You bring back Greg Gaines as your backup nose tackle. Great. You can stuff the run. I don't need him to be a great pass rusher because he's a role player. Maybe a rotational defensive tackle with Logan Hall. No. Pick whichever name you like. They're out there. And it doesn't have to be anyone fantastic because you're just rounding out the roster. So that's kind of my priority going into next week and the free agency starting. Edge, guard, linebacker, and Paulson Adebo, cornerback. That's where I think Jason Light should invest his money. I think you should spend big on linebacker because they're more affordable. I think you should take flyers on players who have been injured or haven't really maximized their talent. And I think the Bucs are in a position to bring in a couple of these guys and make a run at it this year. I don't think that's unrealistic. I think they match up really well with the Eagles. I think they are one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the NFC. I think it's Detroit, I think it's Philadelphia, and I think it's Tampa. And I don't know if that's the order I'd put them in. But if it's everything's on the line in the playoffs and you're going to Philadelphia, I'm comfortable with that because I think the Bucs can win that game. You just have to fill out the roster. Bring in a couple of impact players, not superstars even, but impact players, rotation guys, maybe a Pro Bowler, an up-and-comer. The bones are already set. The infrastructure is already there. Your defensive tackle duo might be the best in the NFL. Your offensive line, whoever's starting at left guard, is probably one of the top 5 offensive lines in the NFL. You've got a quarterback who was one of the best in the NFL last year. You've got a superstar wide receiver. You've got an emerging running back. You've got maybe the best safety in football. You have pieces already in place, high-end pieces. Add a couple of more guys, round it out with a strong draft class, which we know Jason Licht can do because he's one of the best general managers in the game. And you're poised to make a run at a Super Bowl. And that's the goal this year. Anything less than that is a failure. Every move from now until the NFL draft should be with that goal in mind. Don't cut corners. Don't go cheap. Take a flyer. And it's okay to go cheap that way. But don't leave any meat on the bones, is what I'm saying. If there's a move to be made, make it. If there is a free agent and you are quibbling over a few million, pony up. Because this is a Super Bowl or bust season. This is your last year with Levante David. I will be shocked if he comes back another year after this. You don't know how many great years Mike has left. He could go for 1,400 yards and 15 touchdowns this year. And next year, he's 650 and 4. We don't know. Wide receivers can drop off a cliff like that. So you really have to push all your chips in the middle right now. And that doesn't have to be trading 3 first-round picks for Myles Garrett, but you do have to make moves. You do have to bring in more talent to put your roster over the top. Because you're not competing with Atlanta. You're not competing with New Orleans or Carolina. Winning the NFC South is a bonus. It is a expectation. The real goal is winning in the playoffs. Beating Detroit, beating Philadelphia, beating Washington, whichever teams you think are the teams to beat, and going to the Super Bowl. Beating the Ravens, beating the Bills, beating the Chiefs, whoever that representative might be. That is your goal. Those are the teams you are measuring yourself against. And right now, it's okay to say those teams are ahead of you. They have some more pieces in place. But that's why you have to go out and acquire those guys. Get yourself another pass rusher or 2. Upgrade at corner. Upgrade at guard. Get a high-end linebacker. Those are all realistic moves. And maybe you can't make all of them, and that's okay. Because the cap is real. Even when you have a guru managing it. But if you get 2 or 3 of those things addressed, and you address the rest in the draft, you're going to be in a really strong position. So that's where I'm at. Free agency starts next week. Hopefully the Bucs can bring back Chris Godwin. I read today his market's going to be higher than expected. His salary is going to be in the ballpark of $25 million. That's going to be tough to accommodate. I don't know if the Bucs are going to be able to afford him. But they drafted Jalen McMillan to play that role. McMillan is a slot player. Godwin is a slot player. And if you're asking who I'd rather have, of course I'd rather have Godwin. He's an all-pro caliber player. He was leading basically every receiving category last year when he got hurt. He is one of the all-time great players in Buccaneers history, one of the best playmakers they've ever had. But if they can't bring him back, then I'm comfortable with McMillan too. Maybe not as comfortable, but we saw J-Mac make some big-time plays down the stretch. He was stringing together multiple games, 50 yards, a touchdown, 50 yards, a touchdown. Baker looked for him in big moments on fourth down, looked for him in the end zone. So, yes, of course we want Godwin back. Of course I would rather have Godwin playing over Jalen McMillan. But if that's not how it shakes out, the ship moves forward. We cannot just move the bar because Chris Godwin doesn't come back. Jason Light's been building this team. They have players in place in case Godwin moves on. So the expectations remain the expectations no matter what happens with Chris Godwin. This is a Super Bowl or bust year. With Godwin or without him. You got to get some of these players in here. Even if it means losing Godwin. Or if you don't get those other guys, you bring back Godwin. You got money, you have to spend it. And you have to spend it now. So, that'll do it for me now. We will be back next week, 9:30. Garrett should be here. We are going to start talking draft. We're going to be looking at positions. We're going to be looking at edge rushers. We're going to look at linebackers. We're going to look at secondary players. Everyone who the Bucs can and should be looking at, we are going to give our opinions on. Because that's what we do. Our draft coverage is second to none. I really believe that. In terms of evaluating players, in terms of knowing the Bucs' tendencies and what they're going to do. So we are going to get deep in the weeds of it in the coming weeks. We'll obviously talk about free agency next week because that will have started. The Bucs will probably have made a signing or two. So we're in full offseason mode. We're going to get into it. Check us out next week, 9:30. We are the Creamsicle Chronicles, and we will see you then. Until then, go Bucs.